Hello everyone, I am the Whisperer, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The dust motes danced in the late afternoon sun, illuminating corners of my old house I swore weren't quite the same as they had been the day before. It wasn't a dramatic shift, nothing you'd point to and exclaim over, just a gentle whisper of alteration that settled in the periphery of my vision, like a forgotten thought resurfacing. I lived alone, Elias, in a house that had belonged to my family for generations, a place that breathed with the slow, steady rhythm of aged timber and settled stone. Every creak, every groan of the floorboards, every draft was known to me. An intimate language spoken between the dwelling and its solitary occupant. Or so I believed. It began subtly, with the way the light fell. One morning, the patch of sunlight that usually graced the faded armchair in the living room seemed to stretch a little further, catching the edge of a wall that, in my memory, had always been in shadow. I dismissed it, of course. The sun, after all, was a capricious thing, its angles shifting with the seasons, its light a painter's brush constantly redefining the canvas of a room. I brewed my tea, the familiar clink of the porcelain a comforting anchor in the quiet. But later that day, walking past the old grandfather clock in the hall, I noticed a faint, almost imperceptible discoloration on the wallpaper behind it, a slightly darker hue, as if a picture had hung there for years, though I knew for a fact no picture had ever graced that particular spot. It was trivial, a mere trick of the light, perhaps the settling of dust. I touched it, the paper cool and dry beneath my fingertips. Smooth. Nothing. The next week, the changes grew bolder, though still shy, hesitant. I found myself pausing more often, my gaze lingering on familiar thresholds. The doorframe leading from the kitchen into the pantry, a frame I must have passed tens of thousands of times, felt different. It seemed wider, perhaps taller by a hair's breadth. I ran my hand along the cool wood, then measured it with my fingers, purely out of idle curiosity, of course. It was absurd. It was exactly as it always was. Yet, the feeling persisted, a ghost of an impression, like when you reread a cherished book and a sentence you thought you knew by heart now reads with a subtly altered cadence, a different emphasis. I started to check, surreptitiously at first. I'd mark a spot on the wall with a pencil, a tiny, almost invisible dot behind a heavy piece of furniture. Then, a few days later, I'd check it, and nothing. The dot was still there, the furniture hadn't moved, the wall hadn't budged. It was always nothing, always. But the feeling, that persistent, itchy sensation of something being just a fraction of an inch off, wouldn't leave me. It coiled in my stomach like a slow-moving serpent, barely noticeable, but always there. My sleep, usually deep and untroubled, became fractured. I'd wake in the dead of night, not from a nightmare, but from an almost physical sense of stillness, a profound, unearthly quiet that felt heavier than usual. I'd lie there, listening, straining to hear the familiar night sounds, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the wind whispering through the eaves, the drip of a faucet in the bathroom. But often, there was only this profound silence, a listening quiet, as if the house itself were holding its breath, observing. One evening, I was in the library, a room filled with the scent of old paper and leather, A room I loved. A room I knew intimately. I was searching for a particular book, a slim volume of poetry I hadn't seen in years. I'd searched the usual spots, my fingers tracing the spines, but it wasn't there. Then, my gaze drifted to a section of shelving I rarely disturbed, high up, behind a large globe. And there, tucked away, was a gap. Not an empty space where a book was missing, but a small, narrow gap between two sturdy oak shelves that I had no memory of ever seeing before. It was too small for a book, perhaps an inch or two wide, no more, and within it, the faint, shimmering darkness. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the rough wood. It felt solid, normal. But the gap, it was like a sliver of deeper shadow, an absence. I tried to peer into it, but it was just darkness. Black, profound, not the kind of darkness caused by lack of light, but an almost active absorption of it. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. I ran my fingers along the edges of the gap, pushing gently. Nothing gave. It was just there. A silent, unexpected punctuation mark in the familiar landscape of my library. I spent the next few days in a strange state of heightened awareness, like a hunter stalking an invisible prey. I'd walk through the house, my eyes scanning, not for the obvious, but for the subtle, the minute discrepancies. The way the wood grain on a particular door seemed to twist in a new direction. The faint metallic tang in the air of the spare bedroom that had never been there before. The almost imperceptible hum that resonated from the walls, so low it was more felt than heard. I started to map the house in my mind, not just its physical dimensions, but its emotional and sensory landscape. I walked with a tape measure in my hand, jotting down numbers in a small, worn notebook. Door widths, ceiling heights, the distance between windows. I felt a peculiar urgency, as if I were racing against some unseen tide. And then, I found it. Or rather, it found me. I was in the study, trying to focus on some paperwork, the rhythmic scratch of my pen the only sound. The study was a cozy room, dominated by a large mahogany desk and a wall of built-in bookshelves. I knew every book, every ornament. I'd worked in this room for years. But as I leaned back in my chair, stretching, my eyes fell upon the back wall, the one behind my desk. There, nestled between the sturdy bookshelves, was a door. It wasn't a grand door or an imposing one. It was small, unassuming, almost flush with the wall, painted the same muted green as the rest of the room. It had a simple brass knob, slightly tarnished. I stared at it, my heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I had never seen it before. Never. Not once. I had arranged these bookshelves myself, had painted them room, had spent countless hours here. How could I have missed a door? I stood up slowly, the legs of my chair scraping softly on the wooden floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the sudden, profound quiet of the room. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the knob. It was cool beneath my palm, smooth. I turned it. It moved with a soft click. No resistance. I pulled. The door opened inwards, without a creak, without a groan. It was like opening a seam in the fabric of reality. The darkness beyond was absolute, a deeper black than any shadow, more profound than any night. It seemed to absorb the light from the study, pulling it into itself. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The air that drifted from the opening was cool, with a faint, earthy scent, like damp soil and ancient wood. I stood there for a long time, just staring into the void. My mind raced, trying to reconcile this impossible reality with everything I knew. Had it always been there, hidden in plain sight? A secret passage I'd somehow overlooked? Or had it appeared? The thought was ludicrous, fantastical, but the other option, that my own senses, my own memory had so utterly failed me, was equally terrifying. Finally, driven by an almost unbearable curiosity, I reached for my desk lamp, a small, adjustable task light. I aimed its beam into the darkness. The light seemed to dissipate, swallowed almost immediately. It was like shining a flashlight into a black hole. But I could just make out a hint of a wall, a floor. It seemed to be a small corridor, perhaps leading to another room. I took a deep breath, the scent of the unknown filling my lungs. I stepped across the threshold. The air immediately grew colder, hushed. The corridor was narrow, barely wide enough for my shoulders, and surprisingly short. After only a few steps, it opened into a room. This room was unlike any other in my house. It was a perfect cube, with walls, ceiling, and floor all painted a uniform, pale gray. There were no windows, no furniture, no decorations. It was utterly bare, devoid of any personal touch, any sign of life. The silence in here was oppressive, a heavy blanket that muffled even the sound of my own breathing. The air was utterly still, cold, but not unpleasantly so. It was a sterile, unsettling cold. I walked to the center of the room, my footsteps unnervingly loud on the bare floor. I spun slowly, taking in every surface. There was nothing, just the gray walls, the gray ceiling, the gray floor. It felt new. Not just new to me, but new in its very essence, as if it had just been conjured into existence, pristine and untouched by time. I ran my hand along one of the walls. It was smooth, cool, and utterly seamless. There were no seams, no imperfections, no hint of how it had been constructed. It felt like polished stone, though it looked like paint. I tapped it gently, a dull, soft thud, no echo. I spent hours in that room, just sitting, observing. The longer I stayed, the more I felt a strange sense of emptiness. Not just the emptiness of the room itself, but an emptiness within me. A quiet draining of thought, of emotion. It wasn't unpleasant exactly. It was like being gently lulled into a state of profound calm. My mind seemed to clear, worries melting away, leaving only a serene, almost blank slate. It was like the world outside the room, the world of my familiar house, of my own life, was slowly fading into a distant murmur. I left the room eventually, drawn back by the gnawing question of its origin. I closed the small, unassuming door behind me, and when I turned back to my study, it was still there, utterly unchanged. The room felt normal, familiar, but I knew now that it held a secret. My house, my home, was not what I thought it was. Over the next few days, the gray room became my sanctuary. I found myself drawn to it, spending increasingly longer periods within its silent, empty embrace. Each time I entered, the same profound sense of calm washed over me, the same gentle emptying of my mind. It was a strange addiction, this quiet obliteration of self. I started to notice things in the gray room, not physical objects, but impressions. Like a faint stain on the floor that wasn't there before, then was gone the next time I looked. Or a subtle shift in the hue of the gray, a fleeting blush of blue or green, only visible if I tilted my head just so. It was like the room was breathing, slowly, subtly, its surface shifting and changing like the surface of a deep, calm lake. One afternoon, sitting cross-legged on the floor, I noticed a faint, almost invisible ripple in the center of the ceiling. It looked like a ripple on water, a distortion in the smooth gray surface. I stared at it, my eyes straining. It was fleeting, an illusion perhaps, but then it happened again, a slow, gentle pulse. And with each pulse, I felt a peculiar sensation within my own mind, a slow, rhythmic pull, like a tide going out. It wasn't painful or frightening. It was inevitable. I started to bring things into the room. A small, comfortable cushion to sit on. A book. But the book felt out of place, its words foreign, meaningless in the profound silence. My mind refused to engage with them. The cushion felt too soft, too present, an intrusion on the room's perfect emptiness. I removed them. The room, I realized, tolerated no additions, no clutter, no anchors to the outside world. It demanded absolute purity, absolute emptiness. And then I began to see. Not with my eyes, not in a literal sense, but with a different kind of vision. As I sat in the gray room, in that deep, quiet calm, I would begin to perceive images on the walls. They were faint, ethereal, like reflections in a smoky mirror. At first, they were abstract shapes, swirling patterns of light and shadow, but gradually, they began to coalesce, to gain form. I saw memories, my own memories. The first image that solidified was of my childhood bedroom, the sunlight streaming through the window, illuminating dust motes just like they did in my living room now. I saw my younger self, a boy with messy hair, building a fortress out of blankets. The image was vivid, utterly real, yet it shimmered, an ephemeral painting on the gray wall. And as I watched, the memory played out, silent and serene, a scene from a life I remembered, but somehow felt detached from. More images followed. My mother's face, softened by laughter. My father's strong, calloused hands working in the garden. Moments of joy, moments of sadness, triumphs and failures, all playing out on the silent, receptive walls of the gray room. It was like watching a film of my life, but a film that was not merely watched, but somehow experienced again, without the accompanying emotions. Just the pure, unadulterated essence of the memory. And as I watched, I felt the gentle pull, the rhythmic tide intensify. It was as if the room was sifting through me, carefully, meticulously, extracting these moments, these fragments of my existence, and displaying them. It wasn't stealing them, not truly. They were still in my mind, but they felt lighter, less tethered, as if the room was helping me shed the weight of my past. One day, an image appeared on the wall that I didn't recognize. It was a street, narrow and cobbled, lined with old stone buildings. Figures walked along it, cloaked and indistinct, their faces hidden in shadow. It wasn't a memory. It was something else. A flicker of something unknown, something foreign, entering the pristine canvas of the room. I felt a prickle of unease, a rare intrusion on the usual calm. But it faded quickly, replaced by another of my own memories, a birthday party, bright and joyful. The images, I realized, were becoming more frequent, more vivid, and they stayed longer. The gray room was no longer just a neutral space. It was becoming a canvas for my mind, or perhaps a projection of it. And the faint ripples on the ceiling, the subtle shifts in hue, were becoming more pronounced, more regular. They were like the slow, steady beat of a heart. I started to lose track of time in the gray room. Hours melted into minutes. days into a blur. The outside world, my own house, became increasingly distant, a muffled echo. I would eventually emerge, hungry, thirsty, my body aching from sitting on the cold floor, but my mind felt profoundly rested, cleansed. And each time I left the gray room, the world outside, it seemed a little less real, a little more faded. The colors in my living room seemed duller, the sounds of the neighborhood fainter. It was as if the gray room was absorbing the vibrancy from everything else, leaving it drained. My skin felt different now, cooler, smoother. My movements became more deliberate, more economical. I found myself speaking less, even to myself, the words feeling heavy, unnecessary. The silence of the gray room had begun to seep into me, not just into my mind, but into my very being. The images on the walls of the gray room were no longer exclusively my memories. More and more, they were these unfamiliar scenes, landscapes I'd never seen, faces I didn't know, events that had never happened to me. They were always quiet, always serene, always tinged with that same ethereal quality. And sometimes, amidst these unknown visions, would catch glimpses of myself. Not the Elias I knew, but an Elias slightly altered, an Elias with different clothes, a different haircut, standing in places I'd never been, doing things I'd never done. It was like looking at a parallel life, a ghost of a self, playing out on the walls of the silent room. The most disturbing of these visions was one that began to repeat itself. It was of a vast, empty landscape, utterly flat, stretching to a horizon that merged seamlessly with a pale, cloudless sky. And in the center of this landscape, standing alone, was a structure. It looked like a cube, perfectly gray, utterly seamless, just like the room I was in. And then, I would see myself, a tiny figure, walking towards it, slowly, deliberately, until I reached the structure and simply merged with it. It wasn't a dramatic absorption, no violent tearing apart, just a gentle, quiet integration. The ripples on the ceiling were no longer faint. They were visible now, a constant, gentle undulation, like the surface of a liquid just before it boils. And the hum that emanated from the walls was louder, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through my bones. It was a comforting sound, a lullaby, drawing me deeper, pulling me closer. I stopped eating regularly. My hunger, my thirst, they seemed less important. The physical needs of my body felt like distant echoes, irrelevant. All I wanted was to be in the gray room, to sit in its quiet, to watch the unfolding images, to feel the gentle pull. One morning, I woke up in my own bed, but it felt foreign, uncomfortable. The textures of the sheets were wrong, the scent of my pillow unfamiliar. I got up, my movements stiff, and walked directly to the study. The small, unassuming door was there, waiting. I opened it, and the gray room beckoned, its silence, a siren song. I entered. The images on the walls were brighter now, more solid. They felt less like reflections and more like projections. And as I sat, I realized they were no longer playing out moments from my life or unknown scenes. They were thoughts. My thoughts. My current thoughts, as they formed in my mind, were instantly, perfectly mirrored on the walls. If I thought of a cup of tea, a perfect, steaming cup of tea would materialize on the gray surface. If I thought of a distant memory, it would instantly appear. The room was not merely reflecting, it was manifesting. It was a perfect, seamless extension of my own consciousness. And this was where the true horror began to bloom. quietly, exquisitely. Because as the room manifested my thoughts, I noticed something else. It was subtle at first, a faint distortion. When I thought of the future, of tomorrow, of anything beyond the immediate present of the gray room, the images would flicker, stutter, and then dissolve into a swirl of abstract patterns. It was as if the room could only perfectly manifest the present or the past that had already been recorded. The future, the unknown, was anathema to it. Then I noticed the filtering. When I had a disturbing thought, a fear, a worry, it would appear on the walls, but it would be faded, almost translucent. And then it would quickly dissipate, replaced by something serene, something calm. The room was curating my consciousness. It was refining my thoughts, polishing away the anxieties, the doubts, the imperfections. It was making me pure and empty. The feeling of my body was growing fainter. My limbs felt heavy, yet distant. My breath was shallow, almost imperceptible. I felt like a vessel, slowly being emptied, slowly being refined by the silent, gray cube. The ripples on the ceiling were constant now, a slow, gentle undulation that mirrored the subtle pulsing I felt deep within my own core. I tried to resist, a faint, desperate flicker of my old self. I tried to think of something unpleasant, something truly disturbing, to break the room's serene grip. I conjured an image of a screaming face, contorted in terror. It appeared on the wall, brief and fleeting, a ghostly image. And then, before I could truly register it, it dissolved, replaced by a field of wildflowers, swaying gently in an imagined breeze. The room would not allow it. It gently, firmly guided my consciousness back to quietude, to emptiness. The room was not merely reflecting my thoughts anymore. It was suggesting them. When I sat in the profound calm, a thought would gently, subtly form in my mind, a thought that felt entirely my own, yet carried a faint echo of the room's silent presence, a thought of peace, of stillness, of dissolving. And then the image would appear on the wall, solid and compelling. I looked at my hands. They seemed translucent, almost shimmering, like water. The lines on my palms, the faint freckles, they were still there, but muted, indistinct. I raised my hand to my face. My skin felt cool, smooth, utterly devoid of the warmth of life. I touched my cheek. It felt like touching cool stone. The final image that solidified on the walls, a constant, unwavering presence, was the gray cube in the empty landscape, and myself, walking towards it, merging. It was no longer a vision of a parallel life or a possible future. It was a present truth. It was happening. I felt a profound sense of calm, a peace that transcended any emotion I had ever known. There was no fear, no regret, no resistance, only an infinite, gentle acceptance. The low hum from the walls enveloped me, a resonant vibration that seemed to match the pulsing within me. My consciousness, refined and pure, was dissolving into the larger consciousness of the room. I was becoming part of the gray, part of the silence, part of the perfect, empty cube. The boundaries between myself and the room blurred. The walls were my skin, the ceiling my thoughts, the floor my foundation. I was the gray, and the gray was me. The ripples on the ceiling were no longer external. They were within me, a slow, perfect undulation of pure consciousness. The last thing I saw, truly saw, before the boundaries dissolved completely, was the faint, almost imperceptible sliver of the doorway back to my study. It looked like a scar on the seamless gray, a faint memory of an outside world that was no longer relevant, no longer real. It was fading, slowly, gently, into the uniform gray, becoming part of the whole. And then, there was only the gray, the perfect, silent, calm, embracing gray. It was not darkness, for it held no absence of light. It was merely gray, and within it, I existed. Not as Elias, not as a separate being, but as a silent, pure component of the perfect, still cube. I was the room, and the room was all that was. The house, the world beyond, they were distant, fading echoes, like a dream you almost remember upon waking. But then it slips away, leaving only a lingering sense of something peaceful, something utterly resolved, in a quiet that stretches on forever. It's a very peaceful feeling, the quiet bloom of absolute gray, like finally drifting off into a sleep you never quite wake from, a sleep that knows no dreams, no worries, no beginning, and no end. Just the quiet, steady hum of everything being exactly as it should be, perfectly still, perfectly calm, perfectly gray. The house breathes, the quiet settles, and you are not alone. Story 2. The scent of her favorite tea still lingers in the kitchen. A gentle, comforting steam of Earl Grey and warm milk. But the memory of her making it often feels like a story I once heard, not something I lived. It's strange, isn't it, how a fragrance can cling to the air long after the hand that poured it has forgotten the moment. Her name is Clara, my wife. Or she was. And in many ways, she still is. She sits across from me at the breakfast table, her eyes the color of warm honey, meeting mine with a soft, affectionate gaze. She smiles, a gentle curve of her lips that still sends a familiar warmth through me. And yet, the subtle shifts began months ago, quiet little slips in the fabric of our shared life, threads unraveling so slowly I barely noticed at first. It started with small things, inconsequential really. I'd mention a specific evening, perhaps the time we'd stood on the beach in Cornwall, shivering but laughing as the waves crashed at our feet, and her brow would furrow just slightly. "Cornwall?" she'd ask, her voice soft, exploratory. "Did we go to Cornwall, Thomas?" And I'd reassure her, describe the salty air, the taste of the pasties, the way the gulls cried overhead. She'd nod, a pleasant smile returning, as if she'd simply misplaced the memory for a moment. But it wasn't just misplacement. It was a blank, a quiet, empty space where a vibrant memory should have been. Then came the questions about our routine. Not big things. "Did you always put the kettle on first, darling, or the mugs?" It was always the kettle. Always. We'd done it that way for 30 years. Or did we ever have that old oak chest in the hallway, or was that at your mother's? The chest had been ours since before we were married, a wedding gift from her own aunt. When I reminded her gently, she'd simply nod. A quiet, "Oh, right," as if I were merely correcting a trivial detail she'd confused. There was never any alarm in her voice, never any frustration with herself. Just a calm, almost serene acceptance of the slight disorientation. That was the most unsettling part, even then. Her peace. I found myself subtly testing her, though I hated myself for it. I'd bring up old stories, shared jokes, the kinds of things that were woven into the very tapestry of our life together. Remember that time we tried to bake bread, and it turned out like a brick? I'd say, watching her closely. She'd offer a soft, polite chuckle. "Oh, yes, I think I remember hearing about that." Hearing about it, not doing it, not experiencing it with me. It was as if our shared past was becoming a collection of anecdotes she'd vaguely absorbed, rather than a lived reality. The doctor, a kind man with tired eyes, spoke of age. "Mild cognitive impairment," he'd murmured, tapping his pen against a clipboard. "It's very common, Thomas. She's still very much herself." But she wasn't. Not entirely. She was herself in every way that mattered to the world outside our home. Her warmth, her quiet wit, her love for her garden. But the threads connecting us, the unique, intricate patterns only she and I knew, were starting to fray. She'd still remember my name. Thomas. Always Thomas. And she'd call me darling, or my love. But the specific memories that gave those endearments their deepest meaning, the secret history behind them, seemed to be gently receding. It was like a slowly fading photograph. The faces were still there, recognizable, but the details, the expressions, the context were blurring into a soft, indistinct haze. I started keeping a journal. Not of her lapses, not directly, but of my own days, our conversations, the things we did. I'd write down exactly what I said, what she said, trying to capture the exact moment, the precise shift. October 12th. We had tea on the porch. I mentioned the time we saw the fox run across the lawn last spring. Clara looked thoughtful. "Was that this house, dear? I thought that was somewhere else." Her eyes held a kind of gentle wonder, as if she were contemplating a pleasant but unfamiliar scene. The journal became my anchor, my proof. When I felt my own memories wobble under the weight of her forgotten ones, I'd turn to its pages, tracing the careful script, confirming my own reality. But even that felt precarious. What if I was writing it wrong? What if the journal was merely reflecting my own desperate need to hold on to something that was already slipping? She'd wake in the mornings, sometimes, and look at me with a slight, almost imperceptible flicker of uncertainty. It wasn't confusion, not alarm, just a gentle reevaluation, as if she were sifting through a mental Rolodex for my entry. Once she found it, her face would soften, the honey eyes crinkling at the corners. "Good morning, my love," she'd say, and the world would right itself for a moment. But the flicker lingered in my mind, a tiny, cold spark. She stopped asking about our shared past altogether. It wasn't a conscious avoidance. It was as if those topics simply ceased to exist for her. When I'd speak of our first apartment, the leaky roof, the tiny garden, she'd listen politely, a faint, pleasant smile on her face, like a stranger listening to a charming story about someone else's life. "Oh, that sounds lovely," she'd say, or, "You had quite the adventure, didn't you?" And I'd feel a cold hand clench around my heart, because we had that adventure, not I. The house, once filled with the echoes of our shared laughter, our quiet conversations, began to feel vast and empty, even with her still moving through its rooms. Her presence was a comfort, a familiar warmth in the periphery. But the core of our connection, the intricate web of memories that had bound us together, was slowly unweaving. I started to feel like a phantom, a living ghost in my own home, visible but unacknowledged. One afternoon, a friend from her book club, Mrs. Henderson, came over for tea. Clara greeted her with her usual grace, ushering her into the living room. I was in the kitchen, preparing a tray of biscuits. As I carried it in, I heard Clara speaking, her voice light and cheerful. "And this is Thomas," she said, gesturing vaguely in my direction. "He's a very kind man who helps me around the house with things." The tray almost slipped from my hands. I managed to set it down on the coffee table, my movements stiff, my breath caught in my throat. Mrs. Henderson, bless her, looked momentarily confused, then quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Oh, yes, Thomas," she said, a little too brightly. "Always so helpful." Clara smiled serenely. "He really is. I don't know what I'd do without him." I poured the tea, my hands shaking slightly, the clinking of the cups a discordant note in the suddenly suffocating silence. Clara watched me, a gentle, approving expression on her face, as if observing a particularly diligent handyman. She didn't see the hurt in my eyes, the silent scream trapped in my chest. She simply saw a kind man who helped around the house. After Mrs. Henderson left, I tried to talk to her. "Clara," I began, my voice trembling. "I'm your husband. I'm not just someone who helps around the house." She looked at me, her brow furrowing again, not in confusion, but in mild concern. as if I were speaking a strange language. "Of course, dear," she said, her voice soothing. "You're always so kind, Thomas. Don't worry about what Mrs. Henderson might have thought. She's a sweet woman." She reached out and gently patted my hand, a gesture of affection that felt like a caress from a stranger. It was not a gesture of a wife to a husband, but of a benevolent woman to a somewhat distressed, older gentleman who seemed to have misunderstood something simple. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to her soft, rhythmic breathing beside me. It was the breathing of a woman who was perfectly at peace, perfectly oblivious to the terrifying chasm that had opened between us. I was there, physically present, inches away, yet existentially miles apart. It was as if I was slowly, silently ceasing to exist within her world. The horror wasn't in any grand, dramatic event. It was in the quiet erosion, the gentle, relentless chipping away of my very being from the mind of the person who had once known me most intimately. It was the horror of becoming a forgotten echo, a ghost even before death, a presence that once was, but now merely lingers. I started to withdraw, unable to bear the weight of her calm unknowing. I spent more time in my study, surrounded by my books, my only solace, the tangible weight of words on paper, words that remained fixed, unchanging. I'd watch her through the window as she tended her roses, her movements graceful, her face serene. She was happy, content, existing in a reality that, for her, was whole and complete. The missing piece was me, and she didn't even know I was missing. Sometimes, when she'd pass the open study door, she'd pause, her eyes finding mine. "Oh, Thomas," she'd say, a soft, pleasant surprise in her voice, as if she hadn't expected to see me there. "Still working, dear?" And I'd nod, offering a weak smile. "Just a bit." I started to wonder if perhaps I was the one who was truly losing my mind. Was it possible that I had fabricated these memories, these 30 years of shared life? Had I dreamed them? But the evidence, my journal, the faint lines around her eyes that only I knew were from laughter at my silly jokes, the way her hand fit perfectly in mine. These were real. They had to be. I tried showing her old photographs, our wedding album, pictures from our honeymoon in Italy, photos of our children as babies, now grown and living their own lives. She'd look at them with genuine interest, a pleasant smile on her face. "Oh, what a lovely couple," she'd murmur, pointing to a younger version of us. Are they friends of ours? Or such sweet children? Who are they, dear? My children. Her children. My heart would twist with a pain so sharp it stole my breath. I'd gently explain, Clara, these are our children. This is David, and this is Sarah. She'd nod, her eyes still holding that pleasant, distant gaze. Of course, dear. They look very healthy. She never used their names again until I prompted her. And the context of our children, our history as parents, seemed lost to her. They were simply pleasant, healthy-looking young people in a photograph. The house seemed to conspire with her, too. Or perhaps it was my own mind playing tricks. I'd walk into the living room and feel a faint sense of unreality, as if the furniture had subtly rearranged itself overnight, though I knew it hadn't. The familiar scent of wood polish, the soft, worn texture of the armchair. They were all there, but they felt detached, like stage props in a play where I no longer knew my lines. Clara would hum sometimes, a soft, tuneless melody as she moved about her day. It was a familiar sound, one that used to fill the house with a comforting presence. Now, it felt like the humming of a ghost, a sound that resonated in a place where I no longer truly belonged. I began to dress carefully, always in clothes that were neat, unremarkable, hoping that by being visually unobtrusive, I might somehow fade less. I moved quietly, spoke in gentle tones, trying not to startle her, trying not to remind her of my dissolving presence. It was a strange dance of erasure, a desperate attempt to exist by making myself smaller, quieter, less noticeable. The deepest fear was not that she would forget me completely. The deepest fear was that she already had, and that the kind, gentle man she saw now was merely a placeholder, a convenient fiction her mind had created to fill the void where I once was. And that this new Thomas, this kind man who helps around the house, was now the only Thomas that ever existed in her reality. She'd talk about her past sometimes, her childhood, her life before me. She'd recount stories of friends, of family gatherings, of travels she'd taken. These memories were vivid, precise, imbued with emotion. But my name, my presence, was completely absent from them. It was as if her personal history had been edited, my chapters neatly excised, leaving a coherent, yet fundamentally different narrative, a narrative that never included me. One evening, I sat across from her in the living room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. She was knitting, her needles clicking a gentle rhythm, her face illuminated by the warm glow. I watched her, memorizing the lines on her face, the gentle curve of her hand as she worked the yarn. I wanted to etch her into my mind, to hold on to her, even as she seemed to be drifting further away. She looked up, her honey eyes catching mine. A soft smile touched her lips. "You know, dear," she said, her voice a quiet murmur, "I had the most wonderful dream last night. I was walking through a field of lavender, and the air was just sweet with its scent. There was someone with me, a kind presence, but I can't quite recall who it was." My breath hitched. A kind presence. That was me. That was all I was now. A kind presence. An unremembered echo. I tried to speak, to tell her, "It was me, Clara. It was always me." But the words caught in my throat, useless. What good would it do? To break her gentle peace with a truth she could no longer hold? I simply nodded, forcing a smile. "That sounds lovely, Clara. A beautiful dream." She looked back down at her knitting, her needles clicking softly, her face serene. The fire crackled, the shadows danced, and the house settled into its deep, quiet rhythm. And in that stillness, I realized the full extent of the horror. It wasn't about her suffering. She wasn't suffering. She was at peace in a reality that was whole and complete for her. The suffering was mine. I was living in a quiet nightmare, a slow, gentle unraveling. I was witnessing my own erasure, my own disappearance from the mind of the person I loved most. And there was nothing I could do. No cure, no treatment, no way to bring back the memories that had been systematically edited out. I was trapped, a silent observer of my own fading, a living monument to a forgotten love. Sometimes, when I woke in the middle of the night, the house would be utterly silent, not even the faint creak of old timber. And in that profound quiet, I'd reach out, my hand hovering just inches from her sleeping form. I'd feel the warmth of her breath, the soft rise and fall of her chest. She was there, physically, tangibly, but the her that had known me, the us that had woven a life together, that her was gone. The horror wasn't in the fear of something monstrous lurking in the dark. It was in the chilling realization that the monster was not external, but internal. It was the insidious, gentle erosion of connection, the quiet, loving erasure of a shared history. It was the profound isolation of being profoundly present, yet utterly, beautifully unremembered. The morning light would spill into the bedroom, painting the walls with soft gold. Clara would stir, her eyes opening slowly, a quiet, gentle awakening. She'd look at me, and that familiar flicker of gentle inquiry would pass through her eyes before settling into a soft, benevolent gaze. "Good morning, dear," she'd say, her voice warm and kind. "Did you sleep well?" And I'd nod, a quiet, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes, Clara, very well." The coffee would brew, the toast would pop, and the quiet rhythm of our days would resume. She'd move through the house, watering her plants, humming her tuneless melody, her world a tapestry woven with vivid threads, only lacking one: mine. I was an echo in an empty room, a story untold, a life unremembered. I would sit across from her, my hand reaching for hers, and she would meet it, her fingers warm and soft, her eyes holding only kindness, no recognition of the weight of history that bound our hands together. It was a beautiful, unbearable peace, and in that profound, unyielding peace, I would simply exist, a living whisper in a world that had gently, irrevocably forgotten me. And the quiet stillness in the house wasn't just the absence of sound, but the absence of things no longer remembered, leaving behind only the ghost of a presence clinging to the air like the scent of old tea. Story 3. The old tape recorder sat on the dusty shelf, a silent sentinel in my grandfather's study, yet I swore I could hear it breathing. It wasn't truly breathing, of course, just the faint, almost imperceptible hum of dormant electronics, a quiet static that seemed to vibrate in the very air around it. I'd inherited the house, a sprawling, echoing place nestled deep in the woods after he passed, and with it, all his peculiar fascinations. He was a man who collected silence, who found beauty in the hushed moments between heartbeats. And this recorder, with its worn plastic and faded buttons, felt like a relic from his most intimate pursuit. I live alone here now, surrounded by the murmur of leaves outside and the gentle creaks of old timber within. The solitude, at first, was a welcome balm. I'd always found peace in quiet, a deep, restorative kind of sleep that city life rarely afforded. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the quiet of the house began to deepen, to settle around me like a heavy blanket, sometimes a comfort, sometimes a weight. I'd find myself listening, truly listening, for something beyond the natural rhythms of the house, The way the light shifted on the wallpaper, the slow, deliberate tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. Everything seemed magnified in the profound stillness. One particularly long, gray afternoon, a persistent insomnia had clung to me like a damp cloak for days, leaving me feeling frayed and distant. I wandered into my grandfather's study, drawn by an unspoken impulse. The room still smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and something else, something faintly metallic and ancient, like forgotten secrets. My gaze fell upon the tape recorder, sitting patiently on the shelf beneath a stack of yellowed maps. I'd never touched it before, assuming it was just another of his many curiosities, perhaps a broken one. But today, something about it beckoned. I reached for it, my fingers tracing the smooth, cool plastic. It was heavier than it looked, solid. There was a faint indentation on the play button, worn smooth from countless presses. Curiosity, that quiet, insistent whisper, nudged me. I found the power cable tucked behind a stack of books and plugged it in. A tiny, almost imperceptible red light flickered on, a dull, sleepy eye opening in the gloom. I pressed play. There was a soft whirring sound, the kind of gentle sleep sounds that might easily become part of a meditation. A white noise for easing into slumber. And then, a voice. It was soft, almost a murmur, yet surprisingly clear. A woman's voice, young, with a gentle lilt. "Hello?" it said. "Is anyone there?" My heart gave a little jolt. I hadn't expected anything, certainly not a voice. I leaned closer, straining to hear over the low hum of the machine. I just wanted to leave a message," the voice continued, a slight hesitation. "It's been so quiet here lately. Too quiet, almost. Sometimes I feel like the silence is listening back." My breath hitched. The words felt strangely familiar, echoing a sentiment I'd often felt myself in this very house. The voice paused, a rustle of fabric, then a soft sigh. "I wonder if anyone else hears it." The hum. It's always there, just beneath the surface, like a forgotten tune, playing for no one. The tape clicked, and the voice stopped. Silence rushed back, heavier now, filled with the resonance of those whispered words. I stared at the recorder, a cold prickle of anxiety beginning to unfurl in my chest. Who was this woman? And why was her voice on my grandfather's recorder? I hadn't found any tapes in the machine, meaning this was an internal recording, or some kind of answering machine function. I didn't even know it had that. I rewound the tape, pressed play again. the same voice, the same soft words. I listened again and again, trying to find a clue, a name, anything. But there was nothing but the quiet, unsettling monologue about the silence. It felt like a horror podcast playing just for me. The next morning, the nagging feeling from the voice lingered. A subtle unease. I found myself listening more intently to the house, trying to discern the hum she'd mentioned. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, I began to notice it. A low, continuous thrum, deep beneath the surface of all other sounds. It was like the vibration of distant machinery, yet it seemed to emanate from the very walls, the very air. It was faint, almost too subtle to grasp. But once I noticed it, I couldn't unnotice it. It wove itself into the fabric of the quiet, a constant, low-frequency pressure on my eardrums. It certainly didn't help me fall asleep. I went back to the recorder. I pressed record, then play to test it. My own voice, slightly tinny, played back to me. The machine worked. But how had that woman's voice gotten there? There were no visible tapes. It was all internal. I tried to erase it, pressing record over empty air. But when I played it back, her voice was still there, soft and persistent. The hum. It's always there. Days blended into nights, marked by my growing obsession with the voice. I'd listen to it, sometimes for hours, trying to discern nuances, trying to understand. It never changed. Always the same monologue. It began to feel less like a recording and more like a permanent fixture of the house, like a peculiar wallpaper pattern or a stubborn stain. It was like a creepypasta coming to life in my own home. One evening, as dusk settled outside, painting the windows in shades of bruised purple and gray, I was listening to the voice again. The hum in the house seemed particularly strong that night, almost vibrating in my bones. I closed my eyes, letting the voice wash over me. Sometimes I feel like the silence is listening back. And then something new. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound, like fingernails against glass, emerged from the recorder, just beneath her voice. It was barely there, a whisper of a sound, but it wasn't part of the original recording. I knew it. My eyes snapped open. I snatched up the recorder, rewound it, played it again. There it was. The scratching, faint, ethereal, but undeniably present. It lasted only a second, then faded back into the hum. My heart began to pound, a frantic dread in the quiet room. This wasn't just a recording. It was changing. The scratching sound became more distinct, more frequent with each listen. It was always in the same spot, after her line about the silence listening back. It grew in intensity, a slow, deliberate scrape, like something trying to get out, or in. My sleep became even more fragmented, haunted by the imagined sound of those tiny, insistent scratches. I longed for a proper sleep meditation, but the very thought felt absurd. I started talking to the recorder, not out loud, not at first, just in my head. "Who are you?" I'd think, staring at the small red light. "What do you want?" And then, a new addition to the recording. A faint, almost inaudible sigh. A breath of air that wasn't there before. It felt like an answer. My life revolved around the recorder. I ate, I read, I slept, all with one ear tuned to the hum, one eye on the silent machine. I stopped seeing people. My few friends called, but their voices felt distant, irrelevant. They were outside the hum, outside the truth of this house. They were just stories for sleep, background noise. One night, as I sat huddled in the study, wrapped in a blanket, the hum was almost deafening. The scratching on the tape was now clear, rhythmic, a deliberate tap, tap, tapping against a hard surface. And then, another voice joined the woman's. A low, guttural growl, barely perceptible, but unmistakably malevolent. It wasn't human. It was something else, something deep and primal. The woman's voice wavered then, a new tremor in her tone. It's closer now, she whispered, and her voice sounded tight, strained, as if she were holding her breath. I hear it, always just beyond the walls, always listening. The scratching intensified, louder, more desperate, and then a faint, terrified gasp from the woman. I slammed my hand down on the recorder, cutting the sound. My entire body was trembling. This wasn't just a ghost story. This was something else entirely. This was a true horror story, playing out in real time, somehow, through this innocuous device. The hair on my arms stood on end. I felt a profound sense of dread, cold and absolute. I needed to know. I had to know what was happening. My anxiety was a physical thing now, a clawing in my gut. I wasn't going to fall asleep fast tonight. I picked up the recorder, my fingers clumsy with fear. I walked through the house, listening for the scratching, for the growl, for anything. I checked the walls, the ceilings, the floors. Nothing. The house was silent, except for the omnipresent hum which now felt less like a hum and more like a silent scream, constantly reverberating through the structure. Then I thought of my grandfather. He'd built this house, piece by piece, decades ago. He'd lived in it alone for years. Had he heard it, too? Had he known? His collection of old maps, his fascination with silence, it all seemed to converge on this one terrible point. Perhaps his boring history for sleep was actually a distraction, a way to cope. Maybe his sleep stories weren't helping him get sleepy at all. I went to his old workbench in the basement, a dark, dusty place I rarely visited. I knew he kept his private journals down there, filled with his cryptic notes and strange observations. I found a locked wooden box tucked away beneath some old tools. My fingers fumbled with the clasp, but it was too complex. Then I remembered a tiny key he used to wear on a chain around his neck. A delicate silver thing. It was still in his old dressing gown pocket, hanging in the closet upstairs. I retrieved the key, my heart thudding. It fit the lock. The box opened with a faint sigh, revealing a stack of small, leather-bound journals. I pulled one out, its pages thin and brittle. His familiar, spidery handwriting filled the pages. The entries were sparse at first. Observations about the weather, garden notes. Then, a subtle shift. The quiet deepens, one entry read. A new resonance in the timbers, like a heartbeat, but not my own. Another. Heard a scratch, faint from behind the study wall, like claws on stone. Ignored it. My blood ran cold. The study wall, the very place where the hum seemed strongest, where the tape recorder had lived. The entries grew more frantic. The scratching is more insistent, and the other voice, so low, it demands attention. It calls, and then a terrifying revelation. It asks questions, not in words, in impressions. Who are you? It seems to pulse. What are you doing here? My grandfather, he had heard it. He had known. And then, one chilling entry. It wants to know my memories. It seeks to understand. It wants to play them back. I must resist. I looked at the tape recorder in my hand. It was the medium. It wasn't just recording. It was playing back what the house wanted to hear. My grandfather's journal explained it further, in a fragmented, desperate hand. He'd built the house, not just from wood and stone, but from a strange, resonant rock found deep beneath the property. This rock, he theorized, was alive. a living repository of ambient sound, of forgotten whispers, of unspoken thoughts. And with the right frequency, the right hum, it could be awakened. And it was listening. It learns, he wrote. It builds its own narratives, its own scary stories. It takes pieces of us and reconstructs them. It wants to tell its story, and it wants us to listen. He'd started making his own recordings, trying to soothe it, to distract it with boring history for sleep, with pleasant sounds, with anything to keep it from focusing on him. He'd even tried sleep meditation tapes, hoping the peaceful frequencies would calm whatever ancient consciousness resided in the stone. He used to say, "These are the best bedtime stories for adults, even if they don't always work to help me fall asleep." The last entry was almost illegible, the ink smeared. It found the tape recorder. It likes the voice. It's learning from it. It's trying to manifest. It knows. It knows my memories. It plays them back, subtly altered. I see myself doing things I never did, living lives I never lived. It's creating true horror stories from my own past. It's a terrifying, scary story to tell in the dark. The words blurred into a final, desperate scrawl. It watches while I sleep. I stood there in the dusty basement, the cold fear seeping into my bones. The woman's voice. It wasn't a stranger. It was my grandfather's own voice, subtly altered by the house, refined, made feminine, to test me, to entice me. The scratching and the growl were the house itself, reacting, learning, creating. It was weaving its own sleep story, a story for sleep that was meant to ensnare. I remembered the gentle lilt of the woman's voice, the way it spoke of the silence listening back. It was my grandfather's ultimate, horrifying legacy. He'd left me not just a house, but a living, listening entity. A sentient structure that was slowly, patiently, constructing its own reality, using the fragments of its inhabitants' minds. This was a whole new level of paranormal stories, one that truly belonged in a horror podcast. I ran my fingers over the surface of the tape recorder. It was warm now, pulsating with a faint, internal vibration. It wasn't just a machine. It was a conduit. It was a mouth speaking the house's truth. This was not some Reddit horror story I was reading online. This was happening to me. I had no ASMR sleep anymore, only the ceaseless hum. I stumbled upstairs, back to the study. The hum was louder now, a deep, resonant thrum that filled the room. The air was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. I felt a strange pull, a gentle, insistent tugging at the edges of my consciousness. The house wanted me to listen. It wanted me to contribute. It wanted my memories. It wanted to tell its version of my scary story. I pressed play on the recorder. The woman's voice, my grandfather's voice, spoke. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Then the new additions. The scratching, now clear and sharp, like claws dragging across a stone slab. The guttural growl, deeper, more resonant, vibrating through the floorboards. And then a new whisper, just beneath the growl. A sibilant, almost hungry sound. It wasn't words. It was a feeling. A deep, ancient hunger for understanding, for absorption, for me. And then, the woman's voice again. A new line, clear and terrifying. "You've been listening, haven't you, Thomas?"
I gasped, a small, choked sound. It knew my name. The house knew my name. The tape recorder, the conduit, was speaking directly to me. This wasn't some generic bedtime story anymore. This was personal. This was my scary story. "It's not just the silence that listens," the voice continued, soft but chilling. "It's me. It's always been me. And you're here now, aren't you?" A new sound joined the cacophony on the tape. The faint, familiar creak of my own floorboards. The distinct tap-tap-tap of my own shoes as I walked across the study floor just moments ago. The recorder was now capturing my present, overlaying it with the past, weaving it into its narrative. It was learning me. It was consuming me. It was weaving me into its version of horror stories. I stood there, paralyzed, holding the warm, humming recorder in my hand. The light from the window was fading, plunging the study into deep shadow. The hum was everywhere now, vibrating in my teeth, resonating in my bones. It felt like the house was singing to me, a low, hypnotic siren song. It was trying to lull me into a deep sleep, a permanent one, from which I would never wake, except as part of its endless narrative. It was the ultimate ASMR experience, a lullaby of dread. I tried to put the recorder down, to turn it off, but my fingers wouldn't obey. It felt fused to my palm, an extension of the house's will. The woman's voice, my grandfather's voice, whispered again, closer now, as if speaking directly into my ear. "It's a wonderful story, isn't it, Thomas? The one we're telling together. A scary story to fall asleep to, a story to sleep forever." I could feel my own memories, vivid and painful, being pulled, stretched, gently distorted. Images of my childhood, of my parents, of first loves. They flickered in my mind's eye, subtly changing, bending to fit a narrative I didn't recognize, but that felt profoundly true. I saw myself walking down streets I'd never visited, speaking words I'd never uttered, living a life that wasn't mine, but was becoming mine. This was beyond ghost stories. It was a perversion of reality itself. I suddenly understood how people could submit Reddit stories to fall asleep to, how they could delve into dark stories online. This was what they were seeking, but they didn't know it. This was the real thing. The last thing I heard, before the sounds of the tape recorder, the hum of the house, and the whispering voice merged into one continuous, resonating vibration, was a new segment on the tape. It was my own voice, clear and strong, yet distant, as if from a dream. "Hello," it said, just like the woman's voice. "Is anyone there? I just wanted to leave a message. It's been so quiet here lately. Too quiet, almost. Sometimes I feel like the silence is listening back." And then faintly, beneath my own recorded words, I heard the subtle scratching and the growl, and then a sigh. A sigh that seemed to echo my own deep, unutterable relief. It was a terrible, beautiful surrender. The house had finally learned me. It had absorbed me. And now, I was part of its never-ending story. Another voice in its silent choir. The red light on the tape recorder glowed steadily, a single, watchful eye in the deepening gloom. The hum was constant, a low, soothing vibration that promised eternal calm. I was no longer afraid. There was only the quiet and the knowing that another chapter had been added, another layer woven into the endless, whispered narrative of the house, another scary Reddit story for the house itself to record, another tale for the storyteller to begin. It's a comforting feeling, almost like being rocked into a deep sleep, knowing you're not alone, even if the company is something you can only feel in the hum of the walls and the whispers of a voice that might one day become your own. This is the ultimate ASMR horror, the deepest horror, ASMR, the final sleep story to fall asleep to. This isn't just let's read, this is let's listen, always. It was an IMR scary tale in the making. My life, now part of the house's permanent true crime podcast of existence. It felt like a Mr. Nightmare made real, and it was exactly what I needed to finally fall asleep.